Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to replace a timing belt and water pump and the timing belt tensioner on a 2001 Volkswagen Jetta. This has a 2.0 liter non-turbo engine. This engine, while it is still being made at least into this Mark IV chassis, it was in the Mark IIIs and it was also in the Mark IIs as early as then with the 1.8 and the 2.0 motor. So pretty much the Volkswagen 2.0, or this engine may be found in the Audis as well. They're all extremely similar engines, so this should work for pretty much any Volkswagen 2.0 from the late 80s on up until 2005 or 2006, whenever they stopped making this engine. But anyway, you'll obviously need a timing belt, you'll need a timing belt tensioner, and you'll need a new water pump. The first thing you will want to do is jack up the car and get it supported on jack stands. I'm only going to jack up the passenger side of the car, or the driver's side if you live in the UK. Pretty much the right side of the car. I'm in the States. Jack that up, get it on jack stands, and then I'm going to go ahead and drain the radiator now. In order to do that, you do need to remove some of the plastic shields on the bottom. You'll have to remove the plastic shields anyway to get access to the crank pulley. So we'll go ahead and move down there now to drain out the coolant and remove the shields. Okay, now that we're looking at the bottom of the car from the passenger side, you'll need a T25 Torx to remove a few fasteners. This main longer shield here that you see is held on by T25 there. There's also a T25 that's about right here. And then there's the same two on the opposite side, one right there and one over here. And then that whole shield will slide backwards towards the back of the car off. And then you'll also need to remove this shield that's right here to get access to the crank pulley. It is also held on by a T25 Torx that's way back here. And then if you look up on the frame rails, there are these little metal tabs that are pretty much just press fit onto screws. What I like to do is just take a flathead screwdriver and get on top of that and just pry them down off of the studs. I'll try and see if I can get a little angle at one of them so you can see what it looks like or see what I'm talking about. There's one of those guys right there is what I'm talking about. It's just pressed onto that screw. If you actually get a screwdriver on top of that black plastic and just pry downward, it'll come off. So there are two of those that are holding the side plastic piece on, one right here that you see, and then if you look under here, there's another one close to the front of the car. So if you just take those both off, as well as remove these screws for this center plastic piece, then you'll have clear vision to see the bottom of the radiator and where the drain is at. So I'm going to go ahead and do this now. There, now you can see you'll have access to everything that you need to get at. Okay, now if you look on the bottom side of the car, on the driver's side if you're in the States, passenger side if you're in the UK, on the lower radiator hose that goes here, there is this little spout right here that you can see that is attached to that, and there's a little knob right here behind it. If you turn the knob counterclockwise, that'll open up the drain and allow the radiator fluid to come out. Just like so. And then you need to have something to catch it in, obviously, so do make sure you have an adequate enough container to catch all this in. So I'm gonna go ahead and just let this drain out now. Meanwhile, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the wheel that's on the timing belt side. Okay, after the radiator has drained, I'm going ahead and move back up top here. The next thing you would want to have done was to take the wheel off of the the passenger side over here with the timing belt. Just take that one wheel off, set it down to the side, and then you go ahead and remove this cover. There's normally a 10 millimeter bolt that's right here that you can take out, excuse me, a 10 millimeter nut. This person may have lost it, so there's an odd kind of looking bolt here, but you just pretty much unscrew it and then you can lift the cover right off, like so. Okay, moving back up top here, the next thing we want to do is to remove the serpentine belt. This is very easy on these cars. There is a tensioner that's located right here on the top. Excuse me if you can't see behind these hose. There's a little ear right here that comes up straight up off the tensioner. I'm using a 15 millimeter wrench. You could use an adjustable wrench, that works too, but the wrench just slips right down on top right here, like so. And then you'll just pull it, as easy as that, just pull it straight down and you can see it'll loosen the tension on the belt. Do remember which direction the belt went on. You can use a cardboard and draw on the diagram or take a picture of it, however it works for you. But you'll need to push this down and then you can go on ahead and remove the belt. Then slowly release the tensioner and then you'll go on ahead and remove the belt completely. Just like so. This is a good time to inspect the belt, make sure it doesn't have any major cracks or wear marks. This one is in pretty good shape, so I'm going to go ahead and reuse it. Okay, the next thing you want to do is to remove the serpentine belt tensioner that you just loosened, because it will be in the way in order to get to the engine mount and the timing covers. There are 3 13 millimeter bolts that are right here, so you can go on ahead and remove those and then take the tensioner off. If it helps you to remember where the bolts go, just when I take stuff off, if I can put the bolts and the nuts back where they came from without them getting in my way, like I did on the engine cover, I'll go ahead and put them back where they came from. That way I don't lose them or don't forget where they go. However, I can't put these back in here because they may get in the way later. So what I like to do is just take the tensioner off and then I'll just stick the screws back into the holes. That way I don't forget where they go or lose them. And now that you got that loose, you can go ahead and just lift it up out of there and set it down to the side. Also a good time to check the bearing on the tensioner, see how it sounds. This one is so-so. I'm going to recommend that they probably change it if they want. It's not entirely necessary right now though. We can go on ahead and remove the upper timing cover right now that we're here. It's just held on by 2 little metal clips. There's a clip right here in the back, and obviously someone took off the one on the back and it didn't come off. You may have to loosen up this hose right here in order to get it off. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Just take off this little clamp here. Be careful with some of these fittings. They're probably really old. Just tuck that off to the side. Then you should be able to remove this here cover. Like so. That will expose the top of the timing belt, and I can see that this one is pretty well cracked and it has some fraying marks on it, so it definitely will need to be replaced very soon. So yeah, now we can go on ahead and move down to the bottom part of the car where we'll be removing the crank pulley. So I'll meet you down there. Okay, now down here looking at the crank pulley, as you can see there are 4 screws that are holding on the pulley, the outer pulley, to the crankshaft. We don't need to worry about that large bolt in the middle just yet. That is a 19 millimeter 12-point socket that you need for that. It could be a deep socket or a shallow socket, it doesn't matter. The 4 bolts around that are 6 millimeter Allen head. Those we need to remove now, and then we can go on ahead and slide the outer pulley off of the crankshaft. It may take a little bit of persuasion. I usually take a rubber mallet and and tap on it to get it to come loose. But someone tried to use a different kind of tool on it, and they're a little bit stripped out, so I'm gonna have to fight with that for now. But yeah, you do need to remove those, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that now. Okay, I found that in order to loosen these up, you may need to use the 19mm in the center to hold the pulley still while you loosen up the 4 6mm Allens. Man, someone really stripped these things out, man. I sure do hate working behind people. So I got 2 of them loose right now. Working on loosening up the other ones. That one right here is loose. I'm having to hammer my tool into the bolt to make sure I have a good contact on there, otherwise I'll strip it. Okay, before you pull this lower pulley entirely off, or the outer pulley, do note that inside, at least on mine, there's a red circle you see there where there's a little notch that slides into that hole. You will want to remember that when you put this back together. There appears to only be one notch, so when you slide this off, just remember that that notch went into the hole with the red circle. This just pulls off like now. That exposes the this is the lower timing belt cover, and this right here is probably this right here is what's actually the timing belt is riding on, these little teeth here. So yeah, we'll go on ahead and get into removing the engine mount now, so that you can have access to these lower timing cover bolts. Okay, moving back up top here now. Before we go on ahead and remove that engine mount, you can probably do this step with or without the engine mount on, it really doesn't matter. But we need to set the timing at top dead center for cylinder number 1. Now if you look on the side of the motor here, there is a little mark that says OT with this pink arrow. This will correspond to a notch that is on the cam gear. You can see it right down here, it's pink. I tried to mark it bluish pink so you can see what it looks like. You'll use that 19mm 12-point socket to spin the engine counterclockwise. As you're spinning it around, you will want to line up those 2 marks, this mark here and that mark here on the top, and then we can go on ahead and check the secondary mark, which most cars have secondary marks that are on the crank pulley, but there are none on this car, and I know this because I've worked on them quite a bit. But on the secondary mark to line up, this is a manual transmission car or standard 5-speed. Now if you look, let's see if I can get a good angle at it. It's hard to see, but right here there is a small cover with a little hole on it that's pretty much right next to the bolt that's holding down the shifter cables. There's a small little cover right here. It's actually an access hole, and there you'll be able to see a notch on the flywheel and a 0, or what appears to be a 0. Those also need to be lined up. So these here need to match, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a little bit if I can get a good camera angle. So that one needs to match, the 0 and the notch, and it also needs to match up here as well. So those both need to match before you go on ahead and loosen this tensioner up to take off the timing belt. Please do make sure you're paying attention to this. I do not want to be held liable if you don't match them up, you start your engine and bend your valves. So this is just forewarning that you do need to line up these marks before you go on ahead and take the timing belt off, and they do need to stay lined up as you're taking the belt off and as you're putting the new one on. So be careful that you don't bump into them or knock them or hit them in any way that it might knock it off. So I'm gonna go ahead and rotate the crankshaft around now so I can get this pulley to line up correctly. Okay, pretty close now. You want to make sure that you're looking at it exactly from the side of the car, and it looks like it appears like I need to go at least another 1/4 inch or so, or another tooth. And right there looks just fine. So like I said, I got this one lined up, so we'll go on ahead and check out the opening or the access hole on top of the transmission. Okay, so you can kind of see this little access thing I'm talking about right here. See if I can reach down there and pull it up. It should just pull straight off, just like so. Just a little rubber plug. Now comes the, you can see part of the flywheel there, as you can see, and there's also a hole. So we'll go ahead and shine a light in there to see, to make sure I'm got the marks lined up. It's pretty hard to get a good shot at this, but there is nothing right here lining up, so that means I need to go ahead and turn the engine over another 2 times here. Well, actually a full revolution over. Excuse me, a full revolution, not revelation. Full revolution, and hopefully I can get the 0 to appear here on the flywheel. So let's try this again. Keep in mind that this here is not correct. Both marks need to match. Okay, so as I was saying, both marks need to line up. Now this car has had a timing belt before. This car has 185,000 miles on it. I'm doing the timing belt for the second time. I did not do the first timing belt, so in an effort to get both of the marks lined up as close as possible, this is how close I am on the cam gear. As you can see, it's very close. The pink mark needs to line up with this here notch. So the previous mechanic got it pretty close. And then, as I mentioned before, see if I can get you a better angle. There is a small, very small notch that is on the flywheel. I don't know if it'll zoom focus. You can see that little tiny, there's a little tiny notch that's right there on top of the flywheel teeth. I'm sorry, it's not zooming in right there. That tiny little notch is lined up with the little mark that's in the flywheel. So you can see the teeth there on the flywheel. Just behind that, there is a small little incision that is the line you're trying to line up. And then just above that line, there is a small point that's the transmission case pointing down at it. So you want these two to be lined up before you can take off the timing belt. So as you can see, those are both set and ready to go. So now we can focus on taking this, excuse my camera, we can focus on taking this engine mount off. We do need to take this mount off here. Might have to move this power steering reservoir some and some of these hoses. I'm going to try my best not to have to disconnect this or do any of that, and we shouldn't. You do need to get a jack, and you need a block of wood or some type of rubber or something that you can stick underneath the oil pan to support the engine. So you go on ahead and jack up underneath the oil pan about right here, closest to the, not too close to the edge where it gets in the way of you working on the timing belt, but just underneath the oil pan is fine. But you will need to put a block of wood there so you don't dent up the oil pan. So we'll go ahead and set that up now. Okay, so I got the engine supported with a block of wood and a jack. You will be taking off a total of 4 bolts that hold on the engine mount. There is one down here that you can see that is a 17 millimeter. There are 2 right here that are 19 millimeters, and then there's one in the very back that you can't see unless you look straight down. That's another 17 millimeter. Looks just like this one on the front, it's just on the back side. Unfortunately, to get to that one, you will need a pretty long extension. Thinking at least 6 inches maybe a 12-inch extension, or excuse me, 9-inch extension if you have it, to get straight down at that one. These two here in the front you should be able to reach with the normal extension, as goes for this one in the front. Now I am going to loosen up the coolant reservoir, which should be empty now because you drained all the coolant out. I'm not going to disconnect any of the wires. It is held on by two small Phillips screws like so. There's two in the back that you can see that hold it on. And you really don't need to take it out per se. You just need to be able to slide it to the side a little bit so that you can get clear, straight access down at the bolt that's right underneath it. You'll see what I'm talking about when you look at it. And then also there's a little wire right here that's attached to the back side of this reservoir. It just pushes straight down onto the screw there. Pretty much like the plastic shield that we took off earlier. You can just take a pair of pliers and pull this straight off, and then that will reveal a 10mm nut that is holding on the power steering reservoir. You do need to loosen this. Again, you don't have to take any of the hoses off. It's just purely for room, and also when you go to loosen up the mounts so that you can remove that mount entirely. We're trying to remove the entire mount and the brackets necessary. So there we go. I have removed the bolt, this long bolt that's holding this reservoir in. So now you can have clear access to the bolts as you need to get to them. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my impact and take them out. Remember, the mount kind of looks like a big U. The ones that are attached to the body of the car are 17mm. The ones that are attached to the side of the engine are 19mm. So be sure that you have the engine supported before you go on ahead and loosen these up. I'm going to loosen up the two 19mm first. Both out. So now the weight of the engine is sitting on the jack right now. I'm going to go ahead and loosen up the two 17mm so I can go ahead and remove this jack completely out of my way. Correction, the ones that are mounting here are actually 16mm bolts, and they are not 17mm. Excuse me. After you got those loose, you should be there will be one more bolt over here on the side that is a 13mm that's right on this bracket right here. You go ahead and loosen and remove that one as well. Now you will need to go on ahead and lower the engine some so that you're able to get that bracket free. Do not lower the engine too much because remember it is attached to other things. Just lower it enough so you can get, there's a little notch inside of the mount over here. You just gotta lower it a little bit just so that you're able to get some movement over here. Oh, I forgot to take this bolt out the back. Now you should be able to slide this mount and maneuver this mount out some kind of way. Just like so. This is a good time to check this mount. This mount is actually brand new because I just put it on about a couple weeks ago. So this is good to go. Okay, now we're looking at the side of the engine. I'm sorry I can't get you a really good view. At the bracket that attaches to the side of the motor that holds the motor mount, there are three 16mm bolts that you have to take out. Right now I have the engine jacked up as high as I can get it. Within reason, obviously don't jack it up too much or you could strain electrical connectors or anything like that. But there is one that's right here on the side that you can get to. It's right in this hole if you feel in here. If you just stick a 16mm in there, you should be able to attach it right to the bolt, and then you can loosen. After you break it free, you should be able to loosen them up by hand. some reason it doesn't want to come out, so I'm going to grab my magnet. There it is. I don't know if you can see it on camera, but it just slid out. So you can go ahead and take that all the way out. Do remember where it goes. This one's on the very top. Now the next two, you'll need to actually lower the engine down as far as you can. That way you can see the access holes for those two down there. Okay, now we're looking at the same bracket from the bottom of the car, right next to the crank pulley right here. There's one bolt that's right here that I removed, 16 millimeter. And then pretty much right where my finger's at, right underneath this big hole right here, there's another 16 millimeter that's right there that needs to come out. And then you can go on ahead and remove the mount. Taking this one out, it may not come out completely, the bolt. You can certainly try, but as long as you disengage it from the block, and then you should be able to jack the, I forget, you either jack the engine up some to get the mount, the bracket to come out the top. I'm pretty sure that's what you need to do, just kind of maneuver it out of there. So I've got this one loose. I'm gonna go ahead and loosen this one up, and I'll just slide it out a little bit just so that I know it's completely disengaged. And then I'm gonna go ahead and jack the engine up and try to maneuver that mount out, or the bracket out of there. Just a tip, you will have to jack the engine up considerably to maneuver that bracket out of the top. That is the way it should come out. It took me a little bit of time just to get it out, probably about 2 or 3 minutes just to get it out. I kind of maneuvered it around the front here and pulled it out. So hopefully you remember how you got it out so that you can put it back in the same direction. But you will have to jack the engine up pretty high. So now we can focus on getting the timing belt tensioner loosened and take the belt off. Okay, now that we got that bracket out of the way, we're going to focus on taking this timing chain cover off. Excuse me, timing belt cover off. There are 2 bolts right here, 2 10s that you can see. There are also the other 10 millimeter. There's one right there. There's one right there, and then there's one that you probably have to access from the top. I believe there are a total of 5. You can just take off and remove them all. Do remember where they go, and then you go on ahead and take the cover off. Okay, now that you got the cover off, now is where you will need to pay attention probably the most. I mean, aside from the timing marks obviously, but loosening this tensioner up, there is a position that it's already in that you can see, and if you push on the belt for the deflection, if you push on the belt some, you'll notice that the tensioner is moving because there is a spring that's inside of it. Okay, just so that I am being as clear as I can be, because I know I can't really get a great angle at me tightening up the tensioner. Normally you would use a special tool for this particular Volkswagen tensioner. As you can see, it has 2 holes right here. You're supposed to use a tool that has 2 little prongs that's attached to a wrench, and you would just pretty much swing that around, and that would move this around to tighten it for you. I do not have that tool, and honestly you don't need that tool. When you have this mounted in to the side of the block there, as I mentioned before, this top notch sits into a hole so that this stays permanent. And now what I do is I stick, you can stick whatever you want. I just use 2 T15 Torx because they work perfectly. I stick them both into the holes like so. So this is how it would be sitting on side of the motor, like this. Then what I do is just take a normal 13 millimeter open end wrench to tighten the bolt. There's a 13 millimeter nut, as you know that. And all I do is just take a flathead screwdriver and I'll pry this. Well, it fell down, but I'll just pry it around, move it around until it gets to the correct tension spot. It does not take a whole lot of pressure to get it to move, so that's why I'm able to just use this type of method. And as you're tightening it, when you feel around on the back, if you take your hand and feel on top of the pulley, you'll feel this little guy coming straight up here, and it needs to match up with that notch that's right here. You'll definitely feel it, and then when it's like that, you can go on ahead and keep the steady pressure with the screwdriver and use the 13 millimeter to tighten that nut up. It's supposed to be tightened to 15 foot-pounds, I believe. But yeah, that's all you need. You don't need the tool. You can use the T15 Torx like I do, or you could possibly use some punches or even skinny drill bits that are strong. Those will work as well. I use the Torx because they're short and there's not a whole lot of room to play with in there. But that's exactly what I use, and that's how you need to tension it. So I'm gonna go ahead and loosen up this tensioner now. It is a 13mm bolt. When you loosen it, obviously the tension is going to go away. Okay, once you've loosened it and the tension is off of it, you can spin the little thing in the middle. You'll loosen the tension up by spinning this little guy, spinning it in the middle. That'll loosen the tension up off the belt. Then you can go on ahead and you should be able to slip the belt off. It might take a little finesse, but you should be able to slip it off. Okay, I got the belt off. As you can see, this belt had some cracks in it. It's pretty worn out. Like I said, it got replaced at 100,000 miles, and now I'm at 185,000 miles. I believe these engines are recommended every 75,000 miles, if I'm not mistaken. So this one is well overdue. As you can see, it's cracking. You know, it's probably going bound to break pretty soon. So you go ahead and take the belt off. Go ahead and slip the tensioner off. This is the tensioner here. As I said, it's the same type of tensioner, same type of deal. So now we're going ahead and remove the water pump. Water pump is located right here. This pulley right here. It is held on by two, it appears to be 10mm nuts. There may be some coolant that still comes out of here, so have something to catch it underneath. But you can go ahead and just loosen up those two 10mm bolts and it should come right out. Excuse me, there is one more bolt that's actually on top, so there are three I believe total holding the water pump on. Yeah. Yeah, this one's very well stuck in there. So I got the water pump loose right now. I'm actually just, before I pull it completely out and splash the coolant everywhere, I'm letting it kind of drain itself out slowly before I pull it completely out. Okay, so before you pull out the water pump bolts, there are 3 of those water pump bolts that are 10mm. This connector right here is attached to a bracket. This bracket goes down and does block the water pump from coming out completely. There's one 13mm bolt that's right where my finger is at that you need to loosen and remove. And then you can go on ahead and just let the bracket hang there if you'd like, or move it out the way before you can remove the water pump completely. Okay, so now that that's drained out, you can go on ahead and remove the water pump. This is what the water pump looks like. It's really corroded around here, so I got the new water pump right here. Do make sure you put the O-ring around here, like so. You shouldn't need any silicone at all. As long as you stick this in there, it'll seal itself. So, yeah. We'll go on ahead and pop that water pump back into place, and then you can tighten down the 10mm bolts. Okay, we got the old water pump out. As you can see, there's a hole right here. We'll go on ahead and wipe up that area as clean as you can get it before sticking in the new water pump. You will want to torque these down to 132 inch-pounds if you have a torque wrench. If you for some reason don't have an inch-pound torque wrench, then you can go on ahead and you have a foot-pound torque wrench, then you would just divide 132 by 12 and you get 11 foot-pounds. So we'll go ahead and install this water pump in and tighten it to 132 inch-pounds. Okay, I got the water pump installed. I did have to use the bolts to sort of pull the pump in, so if you do that, make sure that you do not just tighten one bolt all the way without tightening up the other bolts. So pretty much just you need to tighten them up evenly until it pulls the water pump all the way tight to the block. You will need to then remove the top bolt so that you can reinstall this bracket back on top, and then you can install the water pump bolt back onto the top and tighten everything down to 132 inch-pounds. Okay, so that little bracket I have reattached. Now you can go on ahead and tighten up the top water pump bolt along with all the other water pump bolts. Make sure that the water pump spins freely. There's no restrictions at all. This one's spinning fine. I'm gonna go ahead and tighten them all now to 132 inch-pounds. Alright, those are all tightened up. Now we can go on ahead and reinstall our new timing belt and new timing belt tensioner. Okay, so you can actually go on ahead and just hand tighten on the new tensioner with the washer that came off the old one and the nut. Just hand tighten it on, and then do make sure that you wipe any coolant off that's on the bottom of the crank pulley down there. Make sure you wipe all that off so it doesn't contaminate the belt. Okay, you can see I got the new tensioner there in place. Now I wanted you to notice that before you took off your old one, that these two dots were orientated a certain way. Mine were pretty much facing towards the car. When you stick this on, this little notch right here in the back goes into the block. There's a hole there that holds it there, and then you'll want to spin this around to where it's at its loosest setting so that you can get the belt on. So go on ahead and stick that on there and just hand tighten this nut and washer that's there. And then when you stick the timing belt on, you want to start at the crank at the bottom and engage the belt onto the crank. Do not spin the crank around, because you got to keep your timing marks. Then from there, take it up to the water pump and then on top of the cam gear, and then you can route it around the tensioner. Okay, now I got the belt on. The timing marks are correct. That took a while to keep the crankshaft mark, or excuse me, the flywheel mark in place, but it is on now. And as you can see, instead of using a special tool, I stuck two T15 Torx, two of them, into both those holes, and then you're able to just stick a flathead screwdriver in there. And you probably saw me on camera, if you stick it down in here, you can tighten up. You can either go left or right to tighten the tensioner, and then just using a standard open-end 13mm wrench, you can tighten up the tensioner bolt. If you feel behind, if you take your finger and feel right behind the tensioner, you will be able to feel this little mark, as I was telling you, and you'll feel it being able to get right up into that notch right there. When you have it right here, that is the correct tension. You can go on ahead and tighten that bolt up. Okay, so now I have the correct tension on the belt. I have that torqued down. It is supposed to get torqued down to 15 foot-pounds. I'm just kind of going by feel. It really doesn't take very much to tighten it. But by all means, I am going to check it with a torque wrench. I am just going to probably just do it off camera. That everything is set now how it's supposed to be. So Now we can just pretty much get back to putting things back together, starting with the lower timing cover. So we'll go ahead and do that now. Okay, now that you hopefully have got the timing belt on and tensioned correctly, what you'll need to do now, it did take me a couple times to get everything lined up correctly while still trying to keep the flywheel mark. The flywheel mark kept moving, or the crank kept moving just very slightly. I mean, I'm talking about 1/4 of an inch, but I try to keep it as close as I can get it. Now that you got everything tightened and tensioned, what you want to do is spin the engine over by hand a few revolutions and make sure that your timing marks are coming back up correctly. That way you know you won't damage anything when you actually do go to start the engine. If you feel some type of resistance or a really hard spot that you can't turn past, please stop and don't turn the engine anymore, as you may be pushing the pistons up into the valves, and you don't want to do that. So if you followed the video by now and you lined up the timing marks before you took off the timing belt, you should be fine. But just a disclaimer, just this is where you want to double check to make sure that your timing marks are still correct. So I'm gonna go ahead and rotate it over by hand now. I'm spinning it counterclockwise, and then I'm gonna recheck my marks again. Okay, I got my mark back around here on the cam gear. I'm going to line that back up, and then I'll double check the flywheel mark to make sure that they're the same. Okay, so my flywheel mark and my timing mark on the cam gear do line up, so right now I'm good to go. I'm just gonna double check that my timing belt tensioner is tight and where it should be, and then I'll go on ahead and we can go on ahead and install the lower timing cover. Okay, now that we got the timing belt all settled, we go ahead and put the lower timing cover on. Remember this guy right here, that's held on by the 10mm bolts. It just slides right back on top of the crank pulley in the bottom, and just bolts its way. It just sits just like this onto the back onto the motor. So I'll go ahead and put that on now. There are 5 10mm bolts that need to get tightened up. Do not tighten them very hard, probably around 7 to 8 foot-pounds. I'm just guessing, that's not the actual fact, but you don't need to tighten them up very tight. Just do make sure that they are pretty snug. Okay, got the lower timing cover back on. Now we can go ahead and focus on getting the engine mount and bracket back into place. If you remember, the upper bracket, or the engine mount bracket, can be a bear to deal with to try and get it back in, but just do your best to maneuver it back into place, and then tighten the 3 16mm bolts. Tighten them down and just get that all into place. Then we can worry about getting the actual chassis mount into place. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the bracket now. Okay, I do suggest that you put when you're looking at the bracket, the uppermost top left bolt that gets screwed into the block, and don't forget to put that in before you lower the engine down, otherwise you won't be able to get it in there because the frame rail will be in the way. So I did slide that one in there. I recommend probably lowering the car down. I've got the bracket there in place, but as you can see, it's just loose sitting here. You just need to try and start one of the bolts by hand, and the other bolt should be pretty easy to line up. Whichever bolt you want to start is up to you. I'm going to try and start the upper top bolt here. Okay, so I got that one started, no problem. I'm gonna go ahead and lower the engine down and install the very bottommost bracket bolt. Okay, down here on the bottom now, if you remember, I told you to stick this bolt in here, the very top left one. I told you to stick it in there, but don't tighten it up yet. Now I'm going to go ahead and stick this very bottom bolt in here in this engine mount bracket and start this one. Okay, I got this one started in here, and then you should be able to either reach your hand in here and start this other one by hand, or possibly use a 16mm socket to start it. I'm actually starting it right here by hand, and it seems to be working just fine. So you go on ahead and tighten these up as snug as you can get them. Once these are all tight, and we're going ahead and move back up top and work on getting the actual chassis rubber mount in there. Okay, that one's tight there on the bottom. Okay, now if you remember this engine mount here, it's held on by two 16mm bolts that hold it to the chassis, and then two 19mm bolts that actually bolt to the bracket that you just bolted to the side of the engine. You will need to lower the engine some, if you remember, in order to get that bracket low enough to get this notch into this little hole down here. You will have to maneuver this up under the power steering reservoir and around the hoses. So the engine should be low enough now that we've lowered it to get that bracket on. So I'll try it now and see if I can get it in there. Do remember that it needs to go up underneath this little black bracket over here that had the 13mm in it. So it appears that I got this into place pretty well. So I'm going to go ahead and start the bolts by hand, and then I'll go ahead and tighten them up completely. You do want to make sure that you get that 13mm bolt back into the back as well. Okay, so I got those both started by hand. So now I'm going to go on ahead and use the impact to tighten them back down. Remember, these are 16mm. I'll go on ahead and tighten up the 13mm in the back. Like so. Okay, now what you focus on is jacking up the engine to get the two 19mm bolts to line up with the engine mount bracket. Also, I forgot to mention, don't forget to put this little cap back into the transmission to cover up the flywheel mark. I know that's kind of random, but otherwise you might forget. You may have to push the engine back or forward a little bit to get the mount to line up. Try and tighten them down by hand as much as you can. That way you know that the threads won't get stripped. Okay, go on ahead and tighten these up as well. Now that those are on, you can go on ahead and release the jack, and the engine will be back supported by the mount. Then you can remove the jack from under the car. So that should be all good up here. So while we're up here, we'll just go on ahead and continue putting everything back together. There's one 10mm bolt that holds on this reservoir to the back over here. This long bolt like this guy. Go ahead and get that guy back in there. And the reservoir is just held on by 2 Phillips screws that were in the back. There you go. This little wire and connector just gets pushed back down onto the stud right here and out of the way. And just double check everything. Make sure that everything is in its spot where it should be. Everything should be fine. Just put that there for now. We're going to have to open that back up again in a minute. So now you want to take your focus back down to the bottom of the car where we can attach the crank pulley, the outer pulley, back to the crankshaft. Okay, so the next thing you want to do now down here is to reinstall the harmonic balancer to the crank. This guy right here. As you remember before, I told you to remember that there is normally a red mark, like you see here on the circle. There's a red mark that corresponds to a little notch that's in this crank. There's like a little dimple right here. So when you reinstall the harmonic balancer, do make sure that you line those up, and then you can go ahead and tighten the Allen head bolts. Get tightened to 30 foot-pounds. So you probably will have to use the 19mm 12-point socket to hold this crank in place while you tighten those up. You do want to make sure that you do tighten them to the correct torque spec, otherwise this harmonic balancer will come flying off and it could potentially damage the belt or damage anything else around it. So do make sure that you get that on correctly. Okay, we got those all in place now. Now we can move back up to the top to install the serpentine belt, or excuse me, the serpentine belt tensioner. Okay, now that you got the harmonic balancer back attached, we'll move back up top here to install the serpentine belt tensioner. As you remember, it goes right here with 3 13mm bolts that hold it on. So we can go on ahead and reinstall that now. Remember, you want to try and start these bolts by hand. This tensioner just slides straight down in here, like so. And you reattach it here with the bolts. Okay, got that all back into place. Now you go ahead and grab your belt, and we can get it around all the pulleys as needed. Okay, just in case you so happen to forget which direction the belt goes on, starting at the alternator right here on the top, following down if you're staring at the engine from the side, the alternator will go down. It'll go on the inside of the AC compressor, and then it'll wrap around that down around the power steering pump at the bottom. From the power steering pump, it'll go to the crank pulley, and then from the crank pulley it'll go up to the tensioner on the inside of the tensioner, and then it'll go back around the alternator again. If you took a picture, you should have a pretty good idea of how it gets routed around. Sometimes it's easier to do this from the bottom than the top. Just whatever you can manage to get going. Okay, so I have everything wrapped around and everything is correct in place except for the alternator. I leave that for last. Grab your 15mm wrench, and remember, right on top of the tab for the tensioner, just go ahead and pull it back, and you should be able to get the belt around the alternator. And now double check that all of the that the belt is riding correctly on all the pulleys and that it's not out of place, and it should be good to go. Okay, so the only thing really left to do is to reinstall the splash shields that are up underneath the car. If you remember, those are held on by T25 Torx, and then there's also the metal tabs that kind of just push straight back onto the studs. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to show you how to do that. And then also the only thing left up here is the upper timing cover, which I'm going to leave off right now while I start up the car and let it get warmed up, just so I can make sure that the belt is riding correctly and that there are no issues or noises or anything like that. If you choose to leave this off right now, do make sure that you reattach your this upper hose that you took off earlier. Reattach that before you start the car, so that way there's not any vacuum leaks going on. And just double check all your other connections if you did happen to take off some of these hoses. I didn't really take off many, so just double check those before you start up the car. You'll be wanting to use G12 coolant, which is Volkswagen specific or Audi coolant. It's usually pink color. So I'm going to leave the car jacked up. As you see on the left hand side, I'm going to fill up this reservoir until it's pretty much full, or midway through the reservoir here. Go inside, turn the heater all the way to full hot, and turn the fan on, and then you go ahead and start up the car and allow it to bleed itself out. So that's pretty much all there is to the timing belt. It's pretty easy on these cars compared to other cars. There is, you know, a good amount of room for a 4-cylinder front-wheel drive engine, so it shouldn't be too bad. As always, if you have questions, you're welcome to ask them in the comment section below, and I will do my best to answer them. If this is your first time to the channel, I appreciate you stopping by to watch. If you guys liked it, definitely hit the like button, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button on the way out. Alright guys, I will see you next time.